A building sits on a side street just off a busy shopping district in a Dominican neighborhood in Washington Heights. A budget store occupies the first floor. The upstairs is vacant. This was a place where several generations of German Jewish immigrants put their community and planted their aspirations, where they met for prayer in a language and with tunes that still rang familiar from their hometowns just an ocean away, in the cities of Munich, Nurenberg, and Fürth. This building was their new home, in a country with a new language and a new dream. This was the home of Congregation Beth Hillel. The founding of this congregation was the initiative of a man who had been an American citizen since early childhood, but had lived in Munich for decades, and returned to the United States with his family in 1932. Mr. Samson Schmidt, a purveyor of dental supplies in the old Munich community, observed the great influx of German Jews to the neighborhood as Nazi persecution intensified overseas. When the Munich rabbi, Dr. Leo Baerwald, was preparing to leave Germany, Mr. Schmidt had the plan of uniting him with his former members to lead them once again. The rabbi arrived in March of 1940, and a congregation was formed in June of that year. A local catering venue, the Paramount Hall, was procured for services and was filled beyond capacity with 800 attendees for the high holidays of 1940. Another Munich businessman, Dr. Hermann Schulein, was persuaded to become the first officer of the young congregation. Schulein left behind a profitable and iconic establishment in Munich. The Lowenbrau Beer Company was his father's business, and it had great prestige in Bavaria. His father, Joseph Schulein, was considered a local hero, employing many Bavarians and treating them well. Hermann had taken over the company and saw the same success, until Lowenbrau was forcibly wrestled from Jewish ownership, or Aryanized, under the Nazis. With a heavy heart that pined for his Munich, Schulein came to America in 1936 at the age of 52, with very little money. He sat in school for several months learning English, and then went to work for S. Liebman Brewers in Brooklyn. There he helped launch what would become an American beer of national renown, Rheingold beer. Schulein, who also had a part in bringing Rabbi Baerwald to America, would stand by the rabbi and see the Shul through its first era, thus recreating a piece of Munich left behind, the Alte Hauptsynagoge in München.
The old synagogue in Munich was incorporated in 1815 with the passing of the Bavarian Jewish Edict for Tolerance. The synagogue practiced what was called liberal Judaism. While there was a liberal approach to Jewish thought and law, there were strong ties to tradition. The prayers were not altered, and the organ was not used on the Sabbath. The community had a building on Westenriederstrasse, which was dedicated in 1826 with King Ludwig I and his wife Queen Teresa in attendance. With the easing of more settlement laws in the 1880s, the community outgrew the structure, which held only 320 people. Land was granted the community by Ludwig II in 1882, and in 1887, a new building was dedicated, designed by architect Alexander Schmidt, who had built the large church in Munich, as well as the landmark Lowenbrau beer Keller. In 1937, on the 50th anniversary, the community came together in a jubilee for the building. The famed cantor Emanuel Kirchner was in attendance, and his tune for Psalms 150 was sung. Kirchner had officiated at the original dedication 50 years earlier, and was now almost 80 years old. He had written over 100 compositions for synagogue choir and organ. In the months to follow the synagogue's jubilee, the accursed Hitler himself would call for the dismantling of the synagogue in the summer of 1938. He called it an eyesore, despite the fact that its architecture matched some of Munich's most important buildings. Some suggest that he couldn't bear to see it when heading to his favorite night spot in the Nazi regime's art hall, Haus der Kunst, and its nightclub. The organ was dismantled and the entire building was razed, with the cost passed on to the Jewish community. Cantor Kirchner sang once more on the last night of services at the synagogue. He would die a year later, bereaved, in a home for the aged.
Much like the Munich congregants, many former members of the Nurenberg congregation had been in New York since the 1930s. They had come together under the leadership of the former Nurenberg rabbi, Dr. Isaac Heilbronn, and the former Nurenberg board member, Richard Jung. Jung had first brought the community to an American synagogue, but found the culture clash unworkable. A few weeks after the high holidays in 1940, the obvious idea of merging with Beth Hillel was brought up. And so, in the spring of 1941, the groups from Nurenberg and Munich became one community with two rabbis as the United Community of Beth Hillel. The Haupt Synagogue in Nuremberg was dedicated in 1874, after a 400-year ban on Judaism in that city. The synagogue sat over the Pegnitz River and was architecturally admired. Visitors could see it from afar, adorning the sky over Nuremberg. This synagogue had an organ and practiced the German form of liberal Judaism as well. In fact, Rabbi Heilbronn was instrumental in writing a guidebook for such congregations. Much like the Munich synagogue, this shul met its fate several months before Kristallnacht, with a direct order by the notorious Streicher to be removed from the skyline as, quote, an eyesore. The community had very short notice and needed to remove the Torahs quickly. A community official, Bernhard Kolb, took one last picture of the Haupt Synagogue before it was dismantled in the summer of 1938. Heilbronn was the assistant rabbi of the main synagogue in Nuremberg and only had the role of head rabbi for 1 year before being temporarily detained on Kristallnacht in Dachau and emigrating in 1939. Nevertheless, throughout his career he was admired as someone who had a special connection to the youth. Richard Jung would go on to establish an immigrant self-help organization in the U.S. called the Blue Cards, where people would mail in pledges that were used to support recently arrived immigrants with immediate cash. The next few years would see its share of upsets. In June of 1943, just 2 years after joining the congregation, Dr. Heilbronn passed away suddenly. His son Erich returned from basic training in the U.S. Army to attend the funeral. After his brief stay at home, he was quickly dispatched to active duty in the Italian front, and was killed in action a mere 7 months later. In fact, 9 young men of the foundling Beth Hillel congregation would perish in the battlefield, and a memorial plaque hung in the Shul for decades after. Due to the warm influence of Rabbi Heilbronn on the youth, Beth Hillel had a thriving social scene with dances and activities for their teenagers. In late 1941, a young, bespectacled Henry Kissinger met Anneliese Fleischer at one of these Beth Hillel events. Although his father was a member of the strictly Orthodox congregation Kahaladoth Yeshurun, Henry liked to spend time with old friends from Fürth at the Beth Hillel youth events. Anneliese and her family were from Nurenberg, and after Henry returned from his military service, the couple married, with Henry's childhood Orthodox rabbi from Fürth, Rabbi Leo Breslauer, officiating. The couple had 2 children before Henry found his way into world politics. This concludes the first era of this congregation, the era before a shul was constructed, an era where young families stepped off of boats, ready to work and hoping to find accommodations for their children in a new society. Hebrew school was held in the apartments of the teachers, and social events were tasteful but austere. Men and women improvised, finding new trades or settling for more menial ways of earning a living. The synagogue bulletin urging the congregants to learn English. It was a new world. It was the immigrant story played out on St. Nicholas Avenue, in one small corner of Manhattan Island.